Well, good evening, everyone. Has science disproved God? Well, first of all, I think we should probably have a look at what science is supposed to be. And here's Bertrand Russell, one of the great brains of the 20th century. I wrote this huge, thick book, which I have on my bookshelf and have never read, called A History of Western Philosophy. And this is what he says about science. He says, whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods. And whatever science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. That's quite an assumption, isn't it? We can only know something if we can measure it in the laboratory. We can't know anything else. It's like assuming that everything is only understandable from the natural world. There's nothing outside the natural world. That's an assumption that he makes. However, to be fair to him, in another part of the book, he also says most of the interesting questions lie outside the competence of science. Has the universe any purpose? Is it evolving towards some goal? To such questions, no answer can be found in the laboratory. And that's self-evidently the case. So, the world views about the origin of things and the relevance of science are probably also summarised by this gentleman. He's a professor of chemistry, or he used to be a professor of chemistry at Oxford University. He says there's no reason, this is a more extreme statement, there's no reason why science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. Every aspect of existence. That's a very bold claim, isn't it? That science can deal with everything. It's not quite what Bertrand Russell said. He said the most interesting questions science couldn't answer. I'm just going to spend a little time on a slightly personal note. I just started a physics degree at a university, and my grandmother gave me a little piece of paper. It was on a little yellow piece of paper, it was. And it had a quotation on it from the Bible. And this is what it said. It says, "Then I beheld the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun, because though a man labour to seek it out, yet he shall not find it. Yea, further, though a wise man think to know it, yet shall he not be able to find it." I thought, well, that's a bit of a put down. I was just starting to learn how everything worked. And here's my grandmother saying you can't do it. It's not possible. But actually, it's interesting, that little quotation is from Ecclesiastes, chapter 8, almost summarises what Bertrand Russell had said. He says the most interesting questions you can't find out. Yea, though a wise man seek to know it, though intelligent super brain think to find it, you won't be able to find it. It's not findable by science. And it's true that some things are unpredictable, and that's been discovered relatively recently, quite recently actually. It's encapsulated in what's called chaos theory. But some things just cannot be predicted, even if you know all the laws that govern the steps from one step to the next, even if you know all those laws, there are some things that you cannot predict. And that's actually quite consistent with what Isaiah the prophet said in this quotation here. "Thou hast heard, see all this, and will not ye declare it? I have showed thee new things from this time." This is what God is saying. "I have shown you new things from this time, even hidden things, and thou didst not know them. They are created now, not from the beginning, even before the day when thou heardest them not, lest thou should say, behold, I knew them." Because you can't know them. There are things that cannot be known beforehand. And what God is claiming here in the scriptures, this is a Bible lecture, obviously, even though we are going to consider some scientific issues, that they're created at a point in time, and they're created by God at a point in time to suit his purpose. And you could never have predicted them. That's what he's saying. And that's true, that there are things that you cannot predict. It's even scientifically true now. Although it hasn't always been the case. Here's a wise statement from a long time ago. This is who lived in 1561, 1626. Francis Bacon. He was known as the father of modern, so-called modern science. And he says actually God has provided us with two books. The book of nature, that's the things that you can explore in the laboratory, and the Bible. That's what, and this great scientist said that, Francis Bacon. And if we look at, in the past, you look down the list of eminent scientists, here's a list of eminent scientists who all believed in God and believed and thought that this belief would actually help their science. It wasn't against their science, it would help their science. You've got Galileo of falling weight fame, and Kepler, who studied the motions of the planets, Pascal, Boyle's law, famous, Newton, probably the greatest scientist who's ever lived, an amazing individual who put together the basic laws that we still use in engineering. Faraday, electrical, Babbage, Mendel studied the elements of life and genetics, how genetics work. Pasteur, he invented how you pasteurize, how you get rid of bacteria. Kelvin, who was a famous engineer and scientist, and Maxwell's equations that describe electromagnetism. And more recently, in the same category, we've got Einstein, probably the second greatest scientist in the world who's ever lived. We know what Einstein's responsible for, amazing ideas, and that's relatively recent. Schrödinger, who's the father of quantum mechanics, and Marconi, who's a brilliant electronics expert. And we could go on. So all these people, these prominent scientists, believed in God, and they believed that this belief was actually not a hindrance to their science, but actually a help to their science. Okay, well, we're going to consider 4 aspects of science and just look at how they bear on whether there is a God or not. We're going to look at the comprehensibility of the universe, the fact that the universe is understandable, the fact that you can see laws that are obeyed, and that's Kepler found out how regular the motions of the planets were. We're going to look at the views about the beginning of the universe. These are scientific views, they're not necessarily biblical views, they're scientific views. We're going to look how the universe is fine-tuned, and I'll explain what I mean by that when I get to it. And just very briefly look at the complexity of the genetic code, which is obviously a relatively recent development in science. This comprehensibility of the universe, the fact that the universe evidently obeys laws. It's not, things don't happen at random. They happen according to fixed and discoverable laws. And this is what Einstein said about it. He says the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. Sounds like a contradiction, but what he's saying is what is amazing is why should the universe be comprehensible? Why should it have structure and a pattern and consistency? And his view clearly was that there was a God who did this, who made it this way. So that's the only slide we have on the comprehensibility of the universe. What about the beginning of the universe? Now, this gentleman here on the right, it's Fred Hoyle. He's a professor, he's dead now. He's a professor of astronomy and experimental philosophy at Cambridge University. He was the most prominent astronomer probably 40, 50 years ago. And during his time, there were 2 competing ideas about the way the universe began or didn't begin. He didn't think it ever began. He thought that he called it continuous creation, and he thought the material in the universe just keeps generating and generating and generating. There was never any beginning or end. It's just a continuous process. And then there was the other competing theory at the time, that no, the universe did have some sort of beginning. The reason that Fred Hoyle was worried about the idea of a beginning was because he realised that a beginning implies a beginner, someone to make it begin. he realised it implied something outside the universe that made it happen. And that was why one of the primary reasons why he rejected the idea of a Big Bang. In fact, he was the one who invented the phrase Big Bang, and it was rather an insulting sort of phrase. He wasn't meant to be a compliment. It was a way of really talking down the idea at that time. But as time went on, there were more discoveries made by astronomers, and it was discovered that, in fact, the universe is expanding. And if the universe is expanding, it must have started somewhere, at some point, and at some time. And that's why the current theory, and it could change again, of course, the current theory is that there is, in fact, an origin to the universe in both space and time. It started somewhere, and it's subsequently been expanding. And the estimate is that it started about 13 billion years ago. We're not asking anyone to believe this, by the way. It's just man's current idea of how the universe began. But it's interesting because it's not at all inconsistent with the idea of a beginner, that there is some source, something that initiated the process. And in fact, that affected Fred Hoyle. I'll come back to him in a minute. Here's another great brain of the 20th century, is Stephen Hawking. It was supposed to be a classical atheist, but this is what he said, and it's quite interesting that as an atheist he said this. It is difficult to discuss the beginning of the universe without mentioning the concept of God. That's an atheist speaking. My work on the origin of the universe is in the borderline between science and religion, but I try and stay on the scientific side of the border. It is quite possible, he says, that God acts in ways that cannot be described by scientific laws. That's an interesting thing for him to say, isn't it, that? And he was edging towards a truth that there can be a being that isn't confined by the laws that he himself has created. That's what he was touching on, and that's because he worked on the borderline here between religion, which inherently contains the idea of an intelligent creator, God, and science, which is confined to the natural world. It can't explore anything outside the natural world. Okay, so that's a little bit of discussion about the beginning of the universe. And really, the modern view, the modern scientific view, is actually more consistent with the idea that there is a God who started it than it was before. The previous idea, where there was no need for a God because nothing ever changed. Things were just continuously created. Next topic is fine-tuning. This is an interesting feature of the universe, which has puzzled a lot of people. Now, an atom that is essential for life is carbon. We're made up of carbon, lots of carbon, and water as well, of course. But there's hydrocarbons which make up most of life. So it's absolutely essential. This element is essential for life. Now, carbon is supposed to have come from two different sources. By nuclear fusion, this is. If you take helium nuclei, now helium nuclei has two protons, that's the red little balls, and two neutrons, that's the green little balls on this picture. And the red little balls, being protons, have got positive charge, and the neutrons, being about the same mass, but they're neutral, they don't have any charge at all. Now if you can manage to get three of those banged together hard enough, then you will make oxygen, which has 6 protons and actually it has 6 neutrons as well. But that only works under some very confined conditions. It's called their ground energy state. The ground energy state of an atom is the lowest energy condition that can exist. atoms can exist in different energy states, and if you fire things at them, they can jump from one energy state to another. And the lowest energy state is called the ground energy state, and that they have to match within 1%. Now, another I'll come back to that in a minute. Another way of making carbon, we can't do it because it involves nuclear fusion, and we can't generate at high enough temperatures to do this. But it's the sort of thing that can happen on the sun, where the temperatures are huge. And if you combine one helium atom nucleus, as there, with a beryllium nucleus, then if you look at that, you would get 6 protons altogether. Actually, you get 7 neutrons, which is a bit too many. So 1 neutron's got to fly off. So you make 6 protons and 6 neutrons. And that will make a carbon atom. So essential for life. But it only works, and this is the statement here, the nuclear ground state energy levels have to match within 1% for this to work. Otherwise, no carbon could ever exist, and no life could ever exist. And it was that discovery, which was made in the last century, that Fred Hoyle confessed that nothing had shaken his atheism as much as this discovery. It's because the nuclei have to be tuned to each other in order to be possible to combine them. There's an even more remarkable thing. We're going to talk about 3 basic forces in nature. The first one we're going to look at is called the electromagnetic force. Now we know we've actually all had experience of this. If you comb your hair, you get the hair attached, don't you, to the comb. So there's an attachment here between the comb and your hair, and that's because of an electromagnetic field. It's an electromagnetic force. In that case, the comb's probably got negative charges and the hair's got positive charges, so they're attracted to one another. In fact, if positive charges tend to repel, and negative charges, negative and positive, tend to attract, unlike charges attract each other. Now that introduces a bit of a problem, because if we're going back to this helium nucleus, we've got 2 positively charged protons right close together. How did they get close together? Why didn't they fly apart like the hair when you comb your hair? Well, that's because there's another force called the nuclear force, and it's a more powerful force than the electromagnetic force, but it only works at close range. So there's another force of nature, fundamental. It's absolutely fundamental to all nature, this. It's strong but short range, whereas the electromagnetic one, the comb, is weak but long range. Now this is the interesting thing, that these forces that have to be matched in order for things to exist. In fact, if they're different by more than 1 part in 10 to the 16, then no stars could have formed. 1 part in 10 to the 16, that's 1 part in 1, and then 16 noughts. Well, 10 to the 6 is a million, so what's that? That's a million, and then that's another 4, so it's 10,000 million. 1 part in 10,000 million. In other words, it's impossible, really. They've got to be exactly matched in order for that to happen. In order for nuclei to form in the first place, there wouldn't have been any stars if that hadn't been the case. That's 2 forces then, the electromagnetic force and the nuclear force, very different, both needed. There's another force called gravitation. It's why we are attracted to the Earth, why we have any weight at all. Because the gravitational force is a force between masses. It's why we keep our feet on the ground. If there were no gravitational force, we'd float off into space. And our weight is effectively the gravitational force between us and the Earth. Now that's got to be fine-tuned as well. If you just fix the electromagnetic force and the gravitational force, and then you disturb them by more than 1 part in 40, then only small stars can exist. if you decrease them by the same amount, only large stars can exist. And you actually need both sorts of stars in order to produce the elements required for life. And it's equivalent to a marksman hitting a coin at the far side of the observable universe. Quite tricky. In other words, things are tuned to an extraordinary level, otherwise they could not exist. The basic laws of physics are tuned to an amazing extent. Sometimes this is called the Goldilocks effect. Why do you think it's called the Goldilocks effect? Remember Goldilocks? It was just right, wasn't it? Her bed was just right, and the size of her bowl was just right. That's why it's called the Goldilocks effect. There's another great physicist called Paul Davies, and he commented on this tuning. He says that the impression of design is overwhelming. He said the impression of design because he himself is an atheist. He says that you've got the impression of design. Yeah, you have. You certainly do have the impression of design. Maybe that's because there is design. So going back to our friend Fred Hoyle again, this was his final comments on this. Having gone from a position of being an out-and-out atheist, this is in the middle of the last century, and I remember it because I remember the discussion. And he says, it looks as if a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces in nature worth talking about. There is a coherent plan to the universe, though I don't know what it's a plan for. That's an amazing statement, isn't it? For this great astronomer and mathematical physicist to make. He's recognizing that there's something there that is monkeyed with, has adjusted, has tuned physics and chemistry and biology. There's some plan or other. He knows there's some plan or other, but he doesn't know what it is. Just before, I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a minute, but just before I do, I want to mention that there's an idea that people come up with to try and get around this fact that the universe is so precisely tuned to exist at all, and how the fundamental constants and the basic forces in nature are so accurately tuned. And they say, oh, well, this is because there's actually an infinite number of different universes with all different constants, and ours just happens to be the one where these things are exactly right. That postulates an infinite number of universes. They call it the multiverse. And this is the comment of another prominent scientist. He's a professor of mathematical physics at Cambridge, or he was. He's former, I think he's retired now. But this is what he says about that. He says, let us recognise these speculations, that's multiverses, for what they are. They are not physics, but in the strictest sense, metaphysics. There is no purely scientific reason to believe in an ensemble of universes. By construction, these worlds are unknowable by us, because they're a different universe. A possible explanation of equal respectability, and to my mind, greater economy and elegance, would be that this one world is the way it is because it is the creation of the will of a creator who purposes that it should be so. I mean, and that's the logic of a scientist. That's not a religious argument, that's the logic of a scientist. Okay, that's about the tuning, the fine-tuning of the universe. There was one more item I wanted to just mention, and that was the genetic code, the complexity of the genetic code. There's a quotation here from a guy called Gene Myers, this is relatively recent now, who's a scientist who worked on the genome mapping, So you map the structure of the human genome, which is an amazing achievement, and means that you can do all sorts of astonishing things with the human gene. And this is what he says about it. We're deliciously complex, he says, at the molecular level. We don't understand ourselves yet, which is cool. I don't know why it's cool, but that's what he says. There's still a metaphysical, magical element. What really astounds me is the architecture of life. The system is extremely complex. It's like it was designed. There is a huge intelligence there. I don't see that as being unscientific. Others may, but not me. So that's a very thoughtful statement, isn't it? By a man who's worked on the complexity of the human genome, the basis of life. Just want to mention one more thing. It's called Aunt Matilda's cake. And this is commonly used to describe the situation that we're in. Okay, we come across a cake. It's quite a tasty-looking cake, isn't it? And so we want to know all about it. So we bring in a nutrition expert, and he analyses the nutritional elements of the cake. And we bring in a biochemist, and he analyses all the chemical aspects of the cake. And in fact, the chemist helps him with that. Bring a physicist in, and he works out things like structure and how it all fits together. A mathematician, how big it is, exactly what it weighs, and we can know all about it. We can know all about this cake. But there's still a question, isn't there? Why was it made? What was the idea of this cake? Fortunately, Aunt Matilda is available, and she's able to provide the answer. The answer is that she's made it for her nephew Jimmy's birthday. And that was the purpose of the cake. But even the greatest scientists in the world couldn't have found that out by analysing the cake. And that's like that contrast between what you can do in the laboratory and what you can't do. You can't know why things are made and for what purpose they're made, because they haven't listened to Aunt Matilda. One of the famous scientists, I think it was Isaac Newton, said that science was like a meandering river. And at one point in time, you're on the river, and the river's going in a certain direction. You think the sea of truth. He talks about the ocean of truth. And the ocean of truth must be in that direction. It must be over there somewhere. But then as time goes on, just like there was a transition between continuous creation and Big Bang, the river changes direction. Oh no, the sea is over there. And then it changes direction. Oh, no, it's over there. And we see that's the way science works. It's not an argument against science. It's just the very nature of things. The ideas change. Discoveries change. New discoveries are made, which change the idea of what the truth actually is. Well, what is the truth? How can we know the truth? We can't know it, like Bertrand Russell said. We cannot find answers to the reasons for the universe's existence in science, in the laboratory. We can only find it if, like Aunt Matilda's cake, we're told about it. And that's the position I believe, and we believe, that we are in. We can take a shortcut to the ocean of truth. How? Because, like Francis Bacon said, we have two books. We have the laboratory, we've got the nature, and we have the Bible. And the Bible is like the Aunt Matilda in that sense. It tells us why. And so we read in one of the prophets in Isaiah here, "For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens," as we read in that psalm, "God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it, he created it not in vain." This has been made for a purpose. "He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is none else." So here is another source of information. It's not derivable from experiment. It's revelation from the origin of things. Science, as we've seen, has got as far as realizing that there's something out there. There's something out there to account for the consistency and the fine-tuning and the wonderful design elements in life. There's something out there, but it can't tell you what it is. But at least it can tell you that there's something worth looking for. And we believe, like Francis Bacon did, that thing that we're looking for is the word of God. We read in that Psalm 33, by the word of the Lord, the heavens were made, and the host of them. And so there is a direct piece of information. And that there is a purpose which God reveals in the scriptures. Know ye that the Lord, he is God. It is he that hath made us, not we ourselves. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. God is the origin of us. So how do we conclude? Perhaps I should just congratulate Brother David on his choice of hymn, because it was perfectly worded to fit in with what we said. The heavens declare thy glory, Lord. In every star thy wisdom shines. Yeah, you can do that. You can see that with science. But when our eyes behold thy word, we read thy name in fairer lines. So there's the two elements that Francis Bacon spoke about. There's the science, there's the laboratory, there's nature, but then there's the Bible, the Word of God. So, very good choice of him. Let's just summarise what we've said. Science has not disproved God. It's impossible to disprove that there's God. That's recognised generally. It's not possible to prove that there's no God. Nobody says it is possible, I think. But the interesting thing is that many of the observations of science in recent years are far more easily explained by an intelligent designer than they are by blind chance. God only seems to be excluded when there is an a priori assumption that he does not exist in the first place. That's the only time where God appears to be unnecessary to people like Dawkins and so on. It's because there's an assumption right from the start that, well, there isn't any God. We've got to explain everything by what we can observe. And anything that we can't explain at the moment is only because we haven't done enough experiments yet. That would be his position. So if you assume that, God appears to be unnecessary. And that's using the narrow definition of science, that the only information we can get is from the laboratory, from studying nature, whereas some scientists, Einstein is one of them, obviously Fred Hoyle was right towards the end of his life, recognised that there's some other source, there's something else going on, there's some other source of information. So we need God, like Aunt Matilda, we need God to reveal to us his purpose, which is otherwise undiscoverable. And he's done this through the Bible. What a privilege then we have. We can actually take a shortcut to the ocean of truth, read the Holy Scriptures and learn what God's intention with the world really is and how we can fit into it. Thank you.